Before we dive into the tales, make sure to hit that subscribe button.
When I was young, my father and I often went hunting together. My father was a real outdoorsman. He was tall and kind of a big guy. He taught me almost everything I know about survival in the wild. I remember one time he told me, in a slightly exaggerated way, how he almost starved to death and survived among wolves and bears. Thanks to my father, I know the diet of almost all animals in the wild, and I remember it even now. For many years, my father was the man who was not afraid of anything. But this changed after an incident. That year we were camping at the foot of a rocky slope in our favorite hunting area. The previous year, I had shot a deer for the first time in my life. I was very excited for the next day. Our plan was to get up before sunrise and head out to the meadows a few kilometers to the west. The deer population in this area was quite good. That night my father was again telling me one of his hunting stories from before I was born. In the middle of the story, we heard a high-pitched scream, and I think my father realized that I was a little scared. So he smiled and told me that the sound belonged to a deer. Seeing my father's relaxed demeanor, I relaxed too. After that, we heard that sound a few more times at different intervals, and after a while it got farther and farther away from us. That night the sky was clear and the air was a little cool. My father said that tomorrow would be a beautiful and tiring day and that we should go to sleep. Every time he was in a good mood, my father would sing a folk song, and I would fall asleep to his voice. I was in a deep sleep. I remember waking up with my father shaking me by the shoulders.
Son, come on, wake up. We have to go. Come on, get up.
The tent was dark. My father was already dressed and ready. I fell asleep. Is the sun up yet? I asked my father. My father shook his head negatively and said,
No, son. Hurry up. You have to get up now.
That's when I heard screams coming from the rock above us, like wailing. The screams were so loud that they seemed to pierce the darkness of the night. At 5-second intervals, the same sound was repeated. The hairs on my arms and the back of my neck started to stand on end. I asked, Dad, what is it? Is it a fox? He said nervously.
No. We have to go now. Quickly.
I hurriedly started to pack. The screams from the rocks above us never stopped. I had just woken up from sleep. My eyes weren't even fully open. My father was acting strangely, and his tone of voice was starting to scare me. He put his bag on the floor of the tent and turned to me and said,
Son, I have never heard such a sound in my life.
At first, the mysterious sound gave the impression that it belonged to an animal screaming for help, but then it became increasingly strange. I thought to myself that maybe it was someone in need of help. My father said,
Pack your things. Take your gun with you.
He was a very meticulous man about gun safety. He would never let me enter the tent with a loaded gun. But now when he told me to load the gun inside the tent, I started to get scared. When we came out, the screaming suddenly stopped. It was as if the owner of the voice had noticed us. I looked up quickly. There was no light at the top of the rock. The rock above us was about 25 meters high and too sharp to stand on. We quickly packed up the tent, and in a few minutes, we were all packed up and ready to set off. The screams started again, but this time they were different. It was like a low hum. It was like the sound of an ambulance siren at the beginning. We started to descend, the sound following behind us. My father had his pistol holstered and his rifle in his hand. Suddenly my father started firing into the air. He fired 2 shots. After the echo of the gun stopped, we waited quietly for a while. There was no sound. We kept going down. After walking for about half an hour, we came out of the forest and reached a meadow. The screams returned, this time at the edge of the forest. My father signaled me to stop. We were holding our breath.
That's not a deer, son.
he said. My father started walking so fast, I could hardly keep up with him. Now we were in a field, stopping every now and then to listen to the sounds. The screams were definitely following us. After a while, we came to a path in another wooded area. We crossed a bridge over a stream and reached a parking lot. Our car was the only car around. We had parked the car a little away from where we were at the time. My father turned to me and said,
I won't stop until I reach the car. Stay close to me.
We started running. The weight of the materials on my back made it difficult for me to keep up with my father. The screams behind us started to get closer. It was pitch black. All I could see was the light of the lantern in my father's hand. I was running in fear, each scream echoing behind me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Before we reached the parking lot, my father suddenly stopped. There had been no screaming for about 2 minutes. My father turned to me and said,
You run ahead of me to the car.
I started running without looking back. Dad was following me. I could hear his footsteps. Just then I heard screams very close by. This one lasted longer than usual. Almost 10 seconds.
Son, run!
My father yelled. I can't remember much until we reached the car. I was running so fast that I had to keep my eyes focused on the road to avoid falling. I could feel my father's breath on the back of my neck. That's when I started to cry. The screaming sound was even worse than before. It was as if whatever was making the sound was desperately trying to reach us. The faster we ran, the closer it seemed to us. I could hear the sound of cars passing by on the highway in the distance. I saw our car up ahead, and my father was running to open the door. My father had started the car before I could reach it. I threw myself in so fast that I hit my knee on the door. We both looked at the edge of the woods as we took a sharp turn out of there. We could not see what was there, but I could still hear her screams, her voice, despite the sound of the car. I will never forget the last thing I heard. It was almost like a laugh, a crazy laugh. As we drove further away, my normal perception and emotions returned and I realized that I was crying. My father had turned white. We stopped at a gas station a few kilometers away. I was hugging my father and crying. When my father and I returned home, we did not tell my mother or my sister what had happened. That remained a secret between us. I tried to talk to him about it several times, but he always dropped the subject. Almost 20 years have passed since that night. Since then, my father and I have never gone hunting, and we probably never will. I moved into an old, creaky house at the edge of town, seeking solace in its isolation. The walls whispered secrets, echoing with stories of the past. Late at night, their murmurs would grow louder, filling the rooms with an eerie presence. One moonless night, as I lay in bed, I heard a child's laughter. It seemed to come from the walls themselves, a phantom echo of youthful innocence. My heart raced, for I knew I was alone. I ventured into the dimly lit hallway, tracing my hand along the peeling wallpaper. The whispers grew more distinct, forming fragmented sentences that chilled me to the bone.
Help me! Trapped! Let us out!
A cold draft swirled, carrying with it the scent of decay. I followed the sound, fingers trembling on the doorknob. The door groaned open, revealing a hidden chamber, dust-covered and forgotten. There, in the corner, stood a child, eyes hollow and vacant. He looked at me, a desperate plea in his gaze. His voice was a mere breath, barely audible.
They won't let us go!
I stumbled back, realizing I was not alone. Shadows danced on the periphery, figures of the long-forgotten souls trapped within these walls. Their faces contorted in silent agony. I fled, but the whispers pursued me, echoing in my mind. Every night, they grew louder, more insistent. I could not escape them. I was bound to this house, as were they. As days turned to weeks, my sanity unraveled. I researched the history of the house, hoping to find a way to release these tormented souls. I learned of a tragedy that had befallen the previous occupants, a family lost to a fire that had consumed the very walls that now entombed their spirits. Armed with this knowledge, I performed a ritual, hoping to set them free. The air grew thick with anticipation, and for a moment, I felt a surge of hope. But then, the whispers turned frantic, mingling with anguished cries. I watched in horror as the walls seemed to pulse, as if breathing. The house rejected my attempts, enraged by my interference. The darkness consumed me, pulling me into its suffocating embrace. Now, I am one with the whispers, a silent wail in the depths of this cursed house. And I warn you, whoever reads this, stay away from that forsaken place. For once you hear the whispers in the walls, you are forever bound to them. I believe in science. It is the only thing capable of answering all of our questions, given enough time. But I have wrestled, for decades at this point, with the memory of what took place in that upstairs room on a moonlit night in a creaking old farmhouse far out in the Virginia countryside. Whatever it was I experienced on that cold night, it was categorically not a hallucination. I was not somehow the originator of the event. It descended on me out of the darkness, with zero regard for any rules of nature or logic. It has defied every one of my attempts at explanation. Often when I think about that very peculiar event from all those years ago, I go to the computer and fire up Google Maps. Something in me needs to make sure the house where this happened is still there and has not been bulldozed to make way for condos or a shopping center. So far, Google has left me reassured. There's the horse barn at the end of a long driveway off of an old, sunken country road. There is a small circular horse track next to the barn, and right next to both is that familiar L-shaped roofline. The house is indeed still there, just more and more occluded by maple trees each year as Google yields its latest version of the map data. At first I'm always relieved to see the house is still there, safe and sound. Preserved. Then I am hit with a generally unsettled feeling, mixed with a tinge of regret and frustration. Let me say that, at the time this happened, I was young and I was fortunate to be very healthy. My mind was not addled by drink nor compromised by drugs. I was getting top marks in college, kept with a good crowd, and was serious about doing well in life after graduation. Since college, I have made my living in software. There have been, thank goodness, absolutely zero mental health issues for me, ever. It was a weekend away from me, back when this happened. My aunt and uncle were living in the old house as renters. I had driven out there to take a weekend break from college and also to get away from my parents for a couple of days. I was living in their basement at the time to save money. Back then, the part of the state where the old house sat was considered more remote than it is today. It was still a relatively isolated place and got very dark at night. This is one of those old houses that has weathered several of the main events in American history. Sections of the basement were hewn from the earth around the time of the Revolution. Half of the existing floors were laid before the Civil War. The rest was built shortly after that. I remember the upstairs bathroom was originally a walk-in closet, shared between two of the larger bedrooms, so that there were 3 doors leading into it. Of course, all the plumbing, heating, and electricity had been tacked onto the house as an afterthought as the years had gone by. Since there was a large family gathering planned for the next morning, a small handful of other relatives stayed in the house the same night I did. But they all slept in other rooms, so nothing happened to them. The house has a central hall with stairs that lead up to a balcony. All of the bedrooms and the upstairs bath open up onto the balcony. I was staying on the side that has 3 small bedrooms, and I was given the smallest of the 3, at the end tucked into the corner of the house. Immediately as you walked into that little room, there was a bed to the right. The bed was situated so that if someone was asleep on it when you walked in, their head would be on the pillow just a few inches from your right thigh or hip, depending on your stature. Walking further into the room, you would eventually reach their sleeping feet. Then another 2 steps would bump you into a small bureau against the wall at the far end. The room had two windows, near to each other down at the end of the room. One was right over the small bureau, and the other was in the adjacent wall, a few feet to the left of the bureau. I remember we all had a happy, but uneventful evening that night. We ate dinner and then watched a few movies in the living room. When it was very late, everyone said good night and went to their separate rooms. I was in bed but was not asleep yet. There was either a full moon or a nearly full moon. I can still remember how the moonlight came in through the windows at the end of the tiny bedroom where I lay. All the lights in the house were off. I remember still being able to clearly see the outline of my feet beneath the covers and make out the small bureau a few feet beyond them in the soft moonlight that shone into the room. Finally, I did drift off, but then came suddenly awake again not long after. This time there was no moonlight. The room was dark. I could no longer make out the shape of the bureau or the outline of my feet at the end of the bed. For some reason, I could still see my hand perfectly well when I held it up in front of my face. But the rest of the room had gone so completely black that I had felt the need to wave my hand in front of my face to make sure I hadn't gone blind. There was this intense buzzing sensation in my head. I say sensation because despite the fact that the buzzing was very loud in my ears, I felt the buzzing as much as I heard it. I remember thinking that I would not be able to hear anything over this buzzing in my head. But just a few moments after thinking that, I distinctly heard a person walk in the room through the door next to me. Whoever it was, they came right in through the door just a few feet from me. I remember I heard them take 2 or 3 steps into that little room and come up to the side of the bed where I was lying. I clearly heard the sound of legs swishing back and forth inside several layers of cloth, like a heavy skirt and apron worn over a few layers of a shift or a silk slip. It was a very distinct sound. I am positive that it was nothing other than that, a person wearing several heavy layers of clothing, walking into my room. I absolutely was not hearing the cat, the furnace, or anything like that. Also, it could not have been any of the women in my family. None of them dressed like that. They all wore blue jeans. Someone in several layers of heavy skirt had just walked into the room and came to stand at my bedside near my head. I will never forget that sound for as long as I live. Of course, I was scared by then and had no idea what was happening. I remember thinking maybe this was one of my female relatives who was staying at the house that night and playing a prank on me, seeing if they could startle me awake. So I threw a half-hearted punch into the dark, a few inches from my head, thinking it would bounce off someone's hip. But my fist disappeared into a veil of black about an arm's length away. Nothing was there where someone should have been standing. There was just darkness. There was not much else I could do at that point. I could have jumped out of bed, or yelled for help, or reached up easily and grabbed the light switch. I did not do anything. I do not know exactly why. For some reason I had suddenly become very passive at that point. To this day I cannot say why I did not react differently. All I can say is that nothing, neither in our nature or our nurture, can prepare a person for an encounter like this. I did nothing because, quite simply, I did not know what to do. Instead, I lay very still in the bed. I looked up at where the ceiling should be and recited the Lord's Prayer out loud into the darkness. Several minutes went past, with me lying there, praying, with that buzzing filling my head while Presence stood beside me. Eventually, the buzzing sound started to go away. Regular house sounds began to return. I could hear the tick of hot water in radiator pipes on the balcony outside my door. I dared to look down towards my feet, and once again could make out the contours of the small bureau, illuminated in the moonlight coming through the windows. I could see my feet under the covers at the end of the bed. So I just lay there. Eventually, I went back to sleep. The next morning at breakfast, I asked my relatives about how they slept. Nobody reported anything odd or unusual. Certainly, nobody launched into any tales of spectral visitations. Why did I not go ahead and blurt out a full description of the absurd experience I had just had? Well, there's no paranormal explanation for that. Just trust me, when I say that family dynamics are weird enough to begin with, not give them any reason to get weirder. So I ate my maple pancakes that morning and never said a word to anyone about anything that went on the previous evening. I never spent another night in that house. Soon, my uncle and aunt moved to another house nearby. In the years that have followed, there have been two close friends in whom I have confided this story. The reaction of the first was to start telling me his own set of ghost stories. They were all ridiculous and obviously made up. I have never been able to talk to him about this again as a result. The other friend, a very intelligent and thoughtful person, whom I risked talking to about this, simply said nothing in response. Of course, I have also told my wife and my kids, but they just think Dad has come up with a really great campfire story. Nobody could possibly believe me, but I know what I went through. My only evidence is that house. That house.